Hey everyone. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe grab a blanket or dim the lights. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere far away, to a place where the world once froze in silence beneath the sound of war. Have you ever wondered what it was like to sleep beneath the earth, with frost creeping over your face, and the sky above filled with gunfire instead of stars? That's what life was like for soldiers in the trenches during the winter of the First World War. Before we go deeper, tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are right now? It's always fascinating to imagine people from all around the world sharing one story, drifting together through time. Now, let's go back to 1915. Thomas Weller was 20 years old when he arrived at the Western Front. He was a farm boy from Yorkshire, quiet, tall, with a kind of calm that came from spending years in the open fields. The first thing that hit him wasn't the sound of artillery, but the smell. A strange mixture of wet earth, smoke, and something sour he couldn't quite name. The trench stretched before him like a scar across the landscape, a maze of mud and sandbags and broken wood. It was December, and the frost had already turned the ground into something harder than stone. His boots sank into mud mixed with ice, and his breath rose in clouds that looked almost ghostly in the pale light. The men who had already been there for months barely looked up as he passed. Some smoked in silence. Others patched their socks or cleaned their rifles with numb fingers. They spoke in short sentences, as if words themselves were too heavy to waste. Above them, the sky was gray and low, the kind of gray that seemed to press down on your thoughts until even silence felt cold. In the distance, you could hear the faint thunder of guns. It wasn't constant. It came in slow, heavy waves, like the heartbeat of something enormous and far away. Thomas was led to his section of the trench, a narrow stretch between two crude wooden ladders. The ground was wet, uneven. Every few feet, water pooled in small, frozen puddles. He was told to dig out a space for himself to sleep, a shallow nook in the side of the trench wall. When he lay down that night, wrapped in a damp blanket, the cold seeped through everything, through the fabric, through his coat, into his bones. He tried to remember what his mother's kitchen smelled like in winter: bread, smoke, stew. But the thought slipped away, replaced by the sharp, metallic air of the front. Around midnight, he woke up to the sound of something scratching near his boots. He reached down and felt movement, a rat, fat from feeding on what the soldiers left behind. He threw it off, but within minutes, another took its place. The trench was alive with them. They were everywhere, running through the dark like shadows with teeth. Someone nearby cursed softly, then laughed in that hollow, tired way that soldiers did when they were too exhausted to care. A few yards away, Private Ellis whispered to no one in particular, "Colder than hell, isn't it?" Someone answered, "At least hell's got fire." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through the trench, and for a brief moment, they weren't soldiers, just men trying to keep warm, trading words for warmth. Thomas stared up at the sky. Somewhere beyond the smoke, the stars were still there. He knew that, but he couldn't see them. He thought of home, of the frost on the fields, of the way the wind used to whistle through the barn. He wondered if the cows were still there, if his father had mended the fence by now. Then a flare went up in the distance, painting everything in a brief, white light. The faces around him looked carved from stone, pale and still. And when the light faded, darkness fell again, thicker than before. In that moment, Thomas realized something that every man in that trench already knew. The war wasn't about battles or victories. It was about waiting. Waiting in the cold, waiting for the next order, the next explosion, the next morning that looked just like the last. And in that endless waiting, life itself seemed to freeze, like water in a rusted canteen. He pulled his coat tighter, buried his hands into the mud, and tried to sleep again, while far away, beyond the frost and the fear, the guns began to rumble once more. The second night was worse than the first. The cold had found its way into everything, into Thomas's coat, his boots, even his thoughts. He could feel the frost forming on his eyelashes when he blinked. Every breath turned to vapor and vanished, like a promise that wouldn't last. The men around him moved slower now. Their words came out as faint clouds in the air, carried away by the wind that moaned softly above the trench. There was no real day or night anymore. The gray sky bled into the gray ground until time itself felt stuck, frozen between dawn and dusk. Every few hours, someone would light a small candle in a tin can, shielding it from the wind with their hands. Its weak flame made the mud look golden for a second, and then darkness again. Thomas found that he missed the dark of home, the kind that felt safe and familiar. Here, the dark had weight, pressed against you, listened to you, breathed with you. He spent most of the night next to Ellis, the private who'd joked about hell the night before. Ellis was older, maybe 30, with a voice roughened by too many cigarettes and too little sleep. He told Thomas that before the war, he'd been a schoolteacher in Manchester. Now, he said with a half-smile, I teach rats how to climb boots. Thomas laughed quietly. Felt strange, laughing here, almost like breaking a rule. But Ellis kept talking, maybe because silence was worse than any shellfire. He told stories of his students, of his wife's terrible cooking, of a pub where the beer was always warm and the piano always out of tune. And for a few minutes, Thomas forgot the smell of rot and the ache in his fingers. When the wind picked up again, they both fell silent. The sandbags rustled, and the trench shivered like a living thing. Somewhere far down the line, a German flare rose into the air, a long, ghostly light that hung over the no-man's land. You could see the twisted wire, the craters, the shattered trees that looked like skeletons reaching for the sky. Every shape out there seemed alive for a second. Then the flare burned out, and all was black again. At dawn, if you could call that dull gray a dawn, a whistle blew softly down the trench. It wasn't the call to attack, just the signal for the morning watch. Thomas rubbed his eyes and climbed onto the fire step, peering over the edge. The world beyond the parapet was a frozen wasteland. Dead grass stood stiff with ice. The ground was scarred with holes that still smoked faintly from artillery shells. Somewhere in the mist, a crow landed on a broken helmet and picked at it like it was just another piece of the field. The silence felt unnatural. He wondered if the Germans were staring back from their own trenches, thinking the same thing. When breakfast came, it was a lump of hard bread and a tin of cold beef that had turned pale with fat. Thomas broke it apart carefully, eating slowly, like it might be his last meal. Ellis dipped his bread into his tea, grimaced and said, "Still better than my wife's cooking." That got a small laugh from the men nearby. It was always the same. Small jokes passed around like warmth, little embers of humanity in a place built for death. By afternoon, the cold began to bite harder. The air stung the skin like needles. Thomas's toes had gone numb, and he could no longer feel his fingers. He tried to rub them together, but it didn't help much. Someone further down the trench began coughing. A deep, wet sound that didn't stop. The smell of damp wool and sickness mixed with the smoke of a dying fire. The medic came by with a tin of ointment, muttering something about trench foot and frostbite. "Keep moving," he told them. "Don't sit too long. Move your toes if you still can." So Thomas walked the narrow line of the trench back and forth, step by step, like a ghost pacing in a grave. He passed faces he barely knew, young, pale, wrapped in scarves, their eyes glazed with exhaustion. No one asked what time it was. There was no such thing anymore. Only the sound of wind, the scrape of boots, and the slow drip of melting frost. That night, when he finally sat down again, Ellis handed him a small piece of chocolate from his pocket. "Save it," Ellis said. "You'll need it when things get worse." Thomas smiled faintly. "Worse than this?" Ellis didn't answer. He just stared ahead, toward the dark horizon, where the world ended and the guns began. The candle flickered one last time before dying out. Thomas lay back against the trench wall, closed his eyes, and listened to the world breathe. The wind, the distant thunder of shells, the quiet rhythm of men trying to survive another night in the frozen earth. By the third day, hunger became a presence as tangible as the frost biting at Thomas's fingers. It wasn't just the emptiness in his stomach. It was the gnawing, persistent feeling that reminded him with every movement that the body demanded more than the trench could give. Rations arrived slowly, sometimes irregularly, carried by tired runners who had to navigate the mud and wire of a frozen battlefield. The tins were cold, sealed with a stubborn metal that resisted opening even as Thomas fumbled with his fingers, numb from the biting wind. Inside, the contents were often hard, gray, and lifeless blocks of beef, dry bread, or a mysterious paste that was supposed to be vegetable stew. Some days, the men traded. A lump of chocolate for a half biscuit, a spoonful of meat for a sip of tea. Ellis offered Thomas a small corner of his ration. "Better to share than to waste," he said, though his teeth were chattering, and his hands shook as he passed the food. Even the smallest exchange carried meaning. Trust, camaraderie, and a sense of humanity preserved in the middle of all that mud and steel. Thomas learned quickly which tins were worth the trouble. The stew, though gray and watery, could be thickened with a scrap of bread. The bread itself was hard, like a slab of stone, but when softened with tea, it became edible, almost comforting. Tea, when there was any, was lukewarm at best, brewed over a fire that barely held its flame in the wind. They drank it slowly, savoring the bitter warmth, telling stories about home, about farms and rivers and pubs that seemed to exist only in memory. The cold made everything worse. Food that might have been palatable in warmer weather became an ordeal in winter. Fat hardened like ice, water froze in cups before they could drink. Even the simple act of chewing and swallowing became a chore, a battle against both frost and hunger. Yet, in those moments, the men laughed quietly at shared grievances, at the absurdity of life reduced to stones of bread and lumps of meat. Some joked about the generals back home, imagining them dining on hot pies while they gnawed frozen rations in the mud. It was dangerous, this laughter, a fragile bubble over the rawness of reality, but it was necessary. Thomas found that he thought constantly about food, not in a greedy way, but as a measure of survival. He remembered the smell of the farm back home, the way his mother baked bread in the morning, the warmth of the oven, the smell of bacon frying. Those memories were more vivid than the gray mud surrounding him, more alive than the frost that seeped into every bone. Hunger sharpened everything. His senses, his awareness of the men around him, even the faintest movement of a rat or a shadow in the trench. Sometimes the officers brought small gifts from behind the lines, a piece of cake, a packet of jam. The men would gather around, passing these treasures as if they were gold. Thomas remembered one particular morning when a tin of condensed milk was handed out. Everyone held their portion carefully, licking the sweetness from their fingers because utensils were frozen and useless. For a few moments, the trench was brighter. There was chatter, even a few quiet jokes, and Thomas felt a fleeting warmth that had nothing to do with clothing or fire. But hunger was relentless. When the last crumbs were eaten, when tea ran out, when even the memory of home's kitchens wasn't enough to fill the emptiness, that's when the true weight of the trench pressed down. The men trudged on, shivering, digging, repairing, carrying rifles and sandbags. Every step required energy that their bodies barely had, yet there was no choice. You ate what you could get, and you endured what you could not escape. Thomas learned to appreciate the smallest morsels, the rare scraps of flavor that reminded him he was still alive. A piece of bread, a sip of tea, the faint taste of chocolate. These were victories, proof that even here, in this frozen, mud-soaked world, life found a way to persist. And in that persistence, there was a quiet courage that no gunfire or frost could take away. As night fell again, the tins empty, the frost relentless, Thomas lay down in the trench, stomach aching with both hunger and cold. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine the warmth of the farm kitchen, the smell of roasted meat, the comfort of bread fresh from the oven. The wind howled above, carrying the faint sound of distant artillery, but for a moment, in that small bubble of memory and shared rations, there was a fragile, flickering light of hope. The winter was not just cold, it was a presence, a living thing that crept into every corner of the trench. Thomas woke that morning with stiff fingers and toes that no longer felt like his own. Even layered coats and scarves couldn't stop the frost from seeping through, turning skin to ice. The mud, already frozen in places and slushy in others, coated the trench floor like a thick, unyielding blanket. It pulled at boots, sucked at every step, and carried the faint but unmistakable scent of decay and sickness. Disease thrived here as much as the cold. Trench foot was a constant threat, a creeping rot that attacked the toes and feet when they were damp too long, turning flesh black if untreated. Thomas had seen it on other men. Pale, swollen feet wrapped in rags, eyes dull with exhaustion and pain. The medics did what they could, rubbing ointments and forcing the men to move, but there were never enough supplies, never enough warmth to completely prevent the spread. Coughs began to echo in the trench, wet and hacking, spreading quickly in the close quarters. Cold, influenza, and the occasional fever were as lethal in their own way as any shell or bullet. Water froze before it could be drunk. Blankets, soaked from earlier rains, never fully dried. Each night, Thomas would wring out his coat as best he could, then shiver under it, trying to convince his body to hold on against the frost creeping up from the ground. Even inside the trench dugouts, the shallow shelters where they slept, warmth was fleeting. A small fire might last an hour before the wind stole the heat, leaving only smoke and blackened wood. Yet life demanded some semblance of motion. Thomas and the men had to patrol, repair, and carry ammunition. Every step, every shovel of mud, every piece of sandbagging was an act of defiance against the cold. Ellis often muttered, "Keep moving, lad. Still got blood in your veins. That's all you need." And so Thomas moved, with numb toes and frostbitten fingers, his muscles protesting with each shiver. The trench was alive with the sounds of suffering. Groans from men trying to stretch frozen limbs, the splintering of wood under frost, the distant drumming of artillery that never stopped. The cold magnified everything. Every cough, every squeak of boots on ice, every scrape of a shovel sounded sharper, crueler. Even rats, fat from scavenging, seemed to move slower, weighed down by frost, their tiny paws leaving frozen imprints in the mud. Thomas learned to recognize early signs of illness in the men around him. Pale faces, lips tinged blue, sluggish movement, murmured complaints of numbness. Each warning sign was a whispered threat. Some soldiers ignored it, thinking it shameful to complain, only to collapse hours later with frostbite or fever. The medics were overworked, and sometimes, despite every effort, there was little to be done. It was a harsh lesson. Here, survival was a combination of vigilance, stubbornness, and a touch of luck. Yet, Even in the frost, the men found tiny sparks of resilience. A shared blanket, a joke whispered between shivering shoulders, a ration of chocolate saved for later. These were treasures, each carrying warmth beyond their physical properties. Thomas discovered that keeping the mind occupied mattered almost as much as keeping the body warm. Stories of home, plans for the future, memories of summer days. These flickers of light kept the darkness of cold and illness at bay. One night, Thomas huddled close to Ellis, sharing a small piece of bread that had been partially warmed over the last week fire. The smell of smoke, the faint taste of melted fat, the warmth of shared breath. For a fleeting moment, the trench felt almost human. He realized then that the struggle against cold and sickness was not fought alone. It was a battle fought together, with quiet acts of care and solidarity that mattered as much as rifles or bullets. By the time the wind eased and dawn approached, Thomas's body ached from frost, fatigue, and exertion. Yet, he had survived another night. Still shivering, still cold, still aware of every frozen inch of his skin, but alive. And in that fragile survival, he found the stubborn thread of hope that would carry him through the days ahead. By mid-December, the cold had become a constant companion, but something in the air felt different that year. Rumors had spread quietly among the men. The Germans, too, were tired of the endless frost and mud, tired of the gunfire that had become their background music. Whispers of a truce on Christmas circulated through the trench like a fragile hope, barely believable, but enough to make the soldiers smile under frozen mustaches and chapped lips. Thomas had learned to temper his expectations. Hope was dangerous here. It could be snatched away in a heartbeat by an unexpected shell or an order to move. Yet, he found himself cleaning his rifle more carefully that morning, as if it might somehow make the day better. Ellis nudged him with a mittened elbow. "Don't get your hopes up too high, lad. But maybe we can have a bit of music tonight." Thomas tried to smile, imagining the tiny glow of firelight and the faint sound of a piano or a song carried over no man's land. As the afternoon sun hovered weakly over the horizon, something remarkable happened. Across the trench line, faint voices began to rise. A German soldier singing a Christmas carol in a soft, trembling tone. Thomas froze, the cold biting at his nose, as another voice joined from a neighboring trench. Soon, men from both sides were singing together, their voices mingling over the frozen battlefield in a way that no one could have imagined. Ellis handed Thomas a small tin of plum pudding he had saved, a treasure preserved from some faraway supply line. They divided it carefully among a few nearby soldiers. The sweetness was faint, almost imaginary, but in that moment, it carried the warmth of home, the comfort of family, the memory of fires and kitchens and laughter. The men shared what little they had: chocolate, tins of meat, even scraps of tobacco, passing them across the muddy divide with careful, wary hands. It was a silent acknowledgement. They were not enemies in this moment. They were human beings, bound by the same frost, the same hunger, the same longing for warmth. Thomas remembered the voices of his parents, singing in the farmhouse, the smell of roasted meat, the crackle of a fireplace. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. For a brief, fragile hour, the trench became something else entirely. A place where memory and reality intertwined, where the war paused long enough for humanity to peek through. Later, candles were lit in tin cans, their flames quivering against the wind. The men told stories, some true, some exaggerated, some pure inventions to lift spirits. They spoke of home, of holidays past, of dreams they dared not fully name aloud. Even in the mud, the cold, the darkness, laughter broke out, quiet but persistent, a defiance of everything the war had taken from them. Thomas noticed small miracles in the simplest things. A perfectly shaped icicle hanging from a sandbag, catching the weak light of a fading sun. The soft crunch of snow under boots, almost musical. A rat, oddly tame in the glow of candlelight, nibbling on a dropped crumb without fear. Every detail, however small, seemed significant on that frozen, surreal day. By nightfall, the singing had faded, leaving only the occasional echo carried by the wind. The candles burned low, their light swallowed gradually by the darkness. The men huddled closer, sharing blankets, sharing warmth, sharing the memory of this brief, unspoken truce. Thomas lay back against the trench wall, stomach full for the first time in days, heart lighter than it had been in weeks. He knew tomorrow, the war would resume, the frost would return with a vengeance, and the horizon would be scarred once again. But tonight, they had touched something sacred, a fleeting proof that even in the frozen mud and chaos of war, life and humanity endured. And as he drifted into sleep, Thomas held onto that small spark, carrying it with him against the coming nights of cold, hunger, and endless waiting. It had been weeks since Thomas last held a letter from home. The post was slow, delayed by the mud, frost, and relentless shelling, and yet every envelope brought a spark of life into the frozen trench. When a runner finally arrived with a small bundle, Thomas's hands trembled as he tore open the damp, slightly torn paper. The words smelled faintly of home. Ink, paper, and something else he couldn't place. Perhaps his mother's hand pressing the envelope too tightly, hoping her warmth could travel across miles of war. The first letter was from his sister, Mary. Her handwriting danced across the page, describing the farm as if it were untouched by war. Cows still grazing, fences mended, and the small cat that had wandered into the barn now sleeping by the hearth. She asked about his health, about the cold, about the men he had met. Thomas read it slowly, tasting every word. It was absurd to think that life could go on there while here, in the trench, men were frozen, coughing, and scraping mud from wooden boards. The second letter was from his mother. Her words were practical, filled with reminders and advice. Keep your coat dry, eat as much as you can, write often, and Thomas, do not forget to stay alive. Thomas pressed the letter to his chest, feeling tears freeze on his cheeks as he imagined her standing in the farmhouse doorway, watching the snow fall over familiar fields. The contrast was unbearable. The warmth of home, the smell of bread, the flickering fire, against the cold, wet trench, the endless mud, and the distant thuds of artillery. He shared a few lines with Ellis, who nodded silently, understanding the ache without need for words. Other men in the trench also received letters, and for a brief time, the trench hummed with quiet voices reading aloud. Some letters were funny, filled with small domestic disasters, like chickens escaping or a neighbor's donkey getting loose. Others were somber, filled with worry, love, or the mundane struggles of a life untouched by war. Each one created a strange tether, a reminder that the world outside still existed, that home was more than a memory, and that someone still thought of them. Thomas spent hours staring at the snow outside the trench, holding the letters in his gloved hands. He imagined walking through the farm, feeling the sun on his face, hearing the birds, the laughter, the quiet, unbroken rhythm of life. And yet, the contrast was jarring. He was here, alive, but suspended between two worlds. The one of home, warm and predictable, and the trench, cold, uncertain, and lethal. These letters became a ritual. Every night, Thomas would read them once, then fold them carefully, keeping them close under his coat. They were more than words. They were anchors, small beacons of light in a frozen, mud-slicked world. He realized that hope could survive even here, not in spite of the war, but alongside it. The letters reminded him why he endured the cold, the hunger, the frostbite, and the fear, because there was a world worth returning to, a life waiting beyond the trenches. Yet, even with the letters, a weight remained. The letters could not fill the emptiness, could not warm his frozen toes, could not keep his stomach full, nor protect him from the unseen danger creeping just beyond the trench. Still, they mattered. They kept his mind tethered to something human, something beyond the mud and wire, something that said, "You are more than survival. You are remembered, and you are loved." That night, Thomas tucked the letters close, letting their words seep into his mind as he lay against the frozen trench wall. The wind outside carried the faint smell of smoke and ice, but in his chest, a small warmth lingered. He closed his eyes and imagined home once more. The firelight, the laughter, the smell of bread, and for a moment, even in the freezing, suffocating trench, he felt safe. The days blurred into one another, and the cold no longer seemed the worst enemy. It was the fear that wrapped itself around Thomas's chest, heavier than any coat, sharper than any frost. Every whistle of wind, every distant crack of artillery, made him start, heart pounding as if it might tear itself free. He had seen men fall before his eyes, friends and strangers alike, sometimes crushed beneath earth, sometimes torn apart by shrapnel, and sometimes simply gone, vanished into the endless mud and frost. One afternoon, a shell exploded just beyond the trench line. The sound rolled over the frozen landscape like thunder, shaking the earth beneath Thomas's boots. Dust and debris rained down, a fine layer of powder that coated everything in white. He stumbled back, clutching his rifle, eyes wide, as a familiar voice cried out. It was Private Harding, one of the older men who had always been careful and quiet. He didn't move again. A glance revealed the tragic finality. The shell had claimed him instantly. Thomas's stomach lurched, but he forced himself to look away, because in that world, staring too long could paralyze you. The fear wasn't constant, but it was persistent. It hid in the shadows, in the quiet moments between artillery rounds, in the rustle of a rat in the trench, in the sudden crack of ice underfoot. Thomas found himself imagining the worst, sometimes seeing shapes that weren't there, hearing voices carried by the wind that whispered threats and warnings. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and broken by nightmares. The screams of men, the smell of blood, the crackling of fire, the relentless frost. Yet, death was also strange in its familiarity. The men began to talk about it quietly, almost casually, as if naming it could somehow soften its blow. Ellis spoke of the men who had died the night before, of their families, of the absurdity of life cut short in mud and wire. They shared memories, telling stories about the fallen, and for a fleeting moment, it was almost comforting. The laughter was hollow but human, a fragile shield against the reality that death was everywhere, unannounced, patient, and merciless. Thomas noticed that fear and courage were inseparable. Every step outside the trench was an act of bravery, not because they sought glory, but because they sought survival. To raise your head above the parapet, to move along the frozen mud, to check the barbed wire or repair the steps. All required a conscious decision to fight against the panic in your chest. Even simple actions, passing a tin of food to another man, offering a word of comfort, sharing a blanket, felt like small acts of defiance in the face of overwhelming mortality. He learned that you could grow used to some things, the mud, the cold, the hunger, but never to the sight of death. Each loss carved a small hollow in the mind, an ache that never fully healed. And yet, life persisted. Men carried on, speaking in whispers, laughing when they could, singing softly at night, trying to thread hope through a world that seemed determined to unravel it. One evening, Thomas sat on the edge of the trench, staring into the gray horizon, thinking of Harding, of men he had never known, of friends who might not survive the week. He felt a peculiar mixture of sorrow and resolve, a realization that fear could not be denied, but it could be endured. In that moment, he understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of continuing despite it. And though the frost seeped into his bones and the night threatened to swallow him whole, Thomas held on to that fragile human truth, ready to face the next morning and whatever it might bring. The trench had a life of its own, beyond the mud, frost, and gunfire. It thrived on stories, whispered tales that wound through the darkness, carrying both dread and fascination. Thomas soon learned that these legends were as much a part of survival as blankets or rations. They gave men something to focus on besides the cold, the hunger, and the constant threat of death. One night, Ellis leaned close, his breath fogging in the icy air, and began to tell a story. "There's a spirit," he said quietly. "They call it the frost wraith. It wanders no man's land when the wind howls just right, dragging the souls of men who froze alone in the mud. They say if you see it, it means someone you care about won't make it through the night." Thomas shivered, not just from the cold, but from the story itself. He looked toward the distant horizon, where the gray sky met frozen earth, half expecting to glimpse some pale, moving figure in the mist. The men around him nodded solemnly, passing the tale along in low voices, adding details with each repetition. By the time the story reached the far end of the trench, the frost wraith had glowing eyes and an eerie cry that haunted the coldest nights. Rumors traveled faster than any letter. Some said German snipers had invisible scopes, trained by witches who cursed the land. Others swore that a tree in no man's land was haunted. Its branches twisted into faces, and at night it whispered the names of men who had fallen. Thomas heard of a trench cat, a phantom feline that appeared to soldiers lost in the mud, guiding them to safety or leading them to misfortune, depending on its mood. The stories were strange, sometimes terrifying, sometimes absurd, yet they did more than entertain. They gave men a way to talk about fear indirectly, to name what was otherwise unnameable. They created patterns in chaos, explanations in a world where bullets and shells often had no reason. Thomas began to repeat the tales himself, embellishing details, seeing the faint smiles on exhausted faces as the tension eased slightly. Some legends were even lighter, almost comforting. A ghostly band of musicians supposedly played Christmas carols on the battlefield, their haunting notes drifting across trenches during moonless nights. Others claimed that certain patches of mud could heal frostbitten toes if you touched them just right, or that rats could carry messages between the trenches. Thomas smiled at these stories, knowing they were unlikely, yet the warmth they brought was real. The line between truth and fiction blurred easily. A shadow here, a noise there, and suddenly a soldier had been saved or cursed by some unseen force. Men began to watch, to listen, to interpret every wind gust, every distant bang, as proof that these legends were real. The trench became a stage, and fear, imagination, and hope were players, dancing in the darkness together. Thomas found that the stories helped him endure. When he felt the frost creeping too deep into his bones, he imagined the frost wraith waiting elsewhere, leaving him untouched. When hunger gnawed at his stomach, he thought of the trench cat, guiding lost rations back to him. When artillery shook the ground, he pictured the ghostly musicians playing softly, reminding him that even in war, music and magic could exist. By sharing these stories, the men forged a fragile bond, a network of shared imagination that kept despair at bay. Even in the frozen, mud-slicked hell of the winter trenches. Laughter and wonder could creep in, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. And as Thomas lay down that night, staring at the gray ceiling of the trench, he felt a strange comfort that even in the worst of winters, stories, like hope, could survive, whispering their warmth into frozen hearts. Night in the trench was a different kind of enemy. By day, the cold and mud were relentless, but night brought shadows, silence, and the unseen. Thomas had grown accustomed to the routine, shifting positions, listening for artillery, keeping watch. Yet each night felt like stepping into another world. The wind whispered secrets over the frozen earth, carrying faint noises that might be real, might be imagined. Every snap of a twig or distant thud made him tense, heart racing as adrenaline sharpened his senses. On his first night patrol, Thomas moved carefully along the trench parapet, rifle ready, eyes straining against the darkness. The snow crunched under his boots, the sound sharp and unnervingly loud in the frozen quiet. Ellis had warned him, "Stay alert. Night hides more than shadows." He had meant the Germans, the mud, the rats, the frost. But Thomas quickly realized that fear itself lived in the night, unpredictable and consuming. Patrolling was a delicate balance between movement and stillness. Too much noise could draw attention. Too little and you might miss something vital. Thomas checked the barbed wire, listening for the faintest movement. Once, a rat scurried past his boots, and for a second, he raised his rifle instinctively, heart hammering, before realizing it wasn't a threat. Every encounter, no matter how small, tested nerves, training, and patience. He encountered more than rats. Shadows on the horizon could be snipers. A sudden shape in the mist might be a fallen tree, or a soldier lost from the line. Once, he glimpsed a figure moving across no man's land. A German patrol, silent, cautious. Thomas froze, hiding behind a mound of mud, barely breathing. They passed without noticing him, their own fear and focus as palpable as his. The moment lasted a lifetime, imprinting a memory of stillness, danger, and relief that would linger for weeks. Night watch wasn't only about avoiding enemy patrols. It was also a battle against the elements. Wind sliced through clothing like blades. Frost stiffened muscles, making movement laborious. Thomas learned to hug himself, to keep blood flowing in his toes, to keep his breath steady. Even the small act of standing on a fire step felt like an ordeal, each second stretching endlessly in the darkness. The patrols also exposed the strange, eerie side of war. Thomas sometimes thought he saw shapes that weren't there. Shadowy figures of fallen soldiers, distorted by moonlight and mist, wandering the frozen landscape. Once, he swore he heard whispers, not of men, but of something else, carried over the trench, fading and returning like a ghostly refrain. Ellis had similar experiences and told him not to fight it. "Sometimes it's better to let the mind wander," he said. So Thomas watched, listened, imagined, and survived, letting stories, memories, and legends mingle with the raw reality of the night. By the end of each patrol, when he returned to the trench dugout, Thomas's legs ached from standing and stepping over frozen mud. His fingers were numb, his ears tingled with cold, and yet there was a small satisfaction in having made it through unscathed. The night was both enemy and teacher, teaching vigilance, endurance, and the fine line between courage and fear. And as he lay down, listening to the distant hum of artillery, the faint whisper of wind over no man's land, and the muffled voices of men keeping watch, Thomas realized that nights were never truly quiet. They were alive with danger, memory, and imagination, and to survive, one had to move through the darkness, step by cautious step, heart racing and mind sharp. Rats were everywhere. They ruled the trenches with a silent tyranny, their small, wiry bodies slipping through the mud, the sandbags, and the splintered wood with uncanny skill. Thomas had seen them scurry past without a care, sometimes bold enough to steal scraps of food right from a soldier's hand. Ellis called them the true kings of the front, and Thomas began to understand why. The vermin were relentless, intelligent, and strangely fearless. They gnawed at boots, blankets, and even the corners of tents, leaving holes that let the cold in like tiny spies. Sometimes, their squeaks in the darkness would wake Thomas in the middle of the night, heart hammering, fingers frozen around the rifle. He would stare into the shadows, imagining dozens of glowing eyes watching him, plotting, daring him to move. The men tried every method to fight back. They set traps using scraps of bread or meat, but the rats often outwitted them, leaving the bait untouched while slipping past to feast elsewhere. Some soldiers claimed to have seen rats as large as cats, their fur matted and gray, their teeth sharp and yellowed. They whispered stories of rats that followed the dead, gnawing at their uniforms or dragging scraps of flesh into the mud. It was grotesque, absurd, and terrifying. Yet, somehow it became part of daily life. Thomas learned small tricks to survive. He would hang scraps of food from ropes, away from sleeping areas, and keep his blanket wrapped tightly. Ellis had a method of stamping at rats when they got too close, sending them scattering with squeals and a furious scurry. Sometimes, the soldiers would chase them together, laughter breaking through the cold, dirty air despite the grisly nature of the hunt. These tiny battles became distractions, small exercises of control in a world where so much else was uncontrollable. Vermin weren't limited to rats. Fleas and lice thrived in the trenches, biting mercilessly, making skin itch under layers of clothing. Mice and other scavengers appeared when food was left unattended, stealing rations and carrying disease. Thomas noticed that men scratched, cursed, and occasionally laughed at the absurdity of their tiny enemies, but the discomfort was constant. Even during the quietest moments, the threat of vermin was tangible, a constant reminder that survival was never clean, never easy. Yet, there was a strange rhythm to it all. Men adapted, learning to coexist with the rats and lice, finding humor in their cunning, and sometimes treating them as characters in the endless, grim story of trench life. Thomas began to name certain rats he saw frequently. A particularly bold one became Sir Whiskers, and he would watch it, marveling at its skill, while knowing that one misstep could leave him with a ruined meal. The vermin taught him vigilance, patience, and a peculiar form of respect. Even in a world dominated by bullets, frost, and mud, these small creatures reminded Thomas that life found a way to persist, to adapt, and to survive against all odds. In some strange sense, they mirrored the soldiers themselves, persistent, cunning, and determined to endure. By the end of the day, Thomas would inspect his blanket, his boots, and his ration tin, ensuring that Sir Whiskers and his companions had caused no new trouble. The rats had won some battles, but they had not broken the men's spirit. In the trenches, life was messy, cold, and relentless, but it was alive, and Thomas, shivering and mud-streaked, felt part of it all. A survivor among survivors, constantly navigating between frost, fear, and tiny, fearless vermin. The sound never stopped. Even in the dead of night, when the wind carried only the faint whisper of frost over the trenches, the artillery roared in the distance, a low, rhythmic thrum that shook the frozen earth. Thomas learned to recognize the difference between a near shell and a distant one, the subtle shift in vibration, the change in echo across the mud and barbed wire. Each blast rattled teeth, sent splinters flying, and left a lingering hum in the bones. Sometimes, The shells were distant enough to be background noise, a dull thunder that almost became part of the rhythm of the trenches. Other times, the earth itself seemed to shiver, a violent reminder of danger, reminding men that survival was precarious, fragile, and constantly threatened. Thomas felt the ground tremble beneath him as he adjusted sandbags and checked the parapets. Each pulse of the earth reminded him that he was small, exposed, and mortal, a fleeting presence in a landscape dominated by steel, fire, and chance. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became impossible when the barrage began, even when the shells were miles away. Thomas lay awake in the dugout, counting the intervals between explosions, listening to the muffled screams carried over the frozen fields, and imagining the chaos no one could see. Even the bravest men flinched, cursed, and whispered prayers, sometimes out loud, sometimes in silent desperation. Shells were unpredictable. Some hit the front lines, tearing earth and men alike apart. Others fell harmlessly behind, their destructive power dissipated into the mud. But even then, the sound was enough to instill fear. Men learned to drop to the ground, to lie flat in muddy cradles, to dig deeper, and to hope their luck held. Yet, there was always that moment before impact. A heartbeat stretched across eternity, a flicker of thought. Will this be the one? Thomas observed how men adapted. Some spoke to the shells, shouting defiance into the cold wind. Others counted them methodically, as if tracking the rhythm could give control over fate. Ellis hummed quietly during the barrage, an absurd attempt to drown the thrum with something human, something alive. Thomas eventually found himself doing the same, letting the vibration of the earth mix with the small melodies of memory, a mental shield against the encroaching panic. The sound of shells changed the perception of time. Minutes stretched endlessly during a bombardment, the pauses between explosions becoming unbearable. Men would move almost mechanically, carrying ammunition, checking dugouts, reinforcing barriers. Every action a dance with fear, choreographed by survival instincts. The mind became trained to notice the faintest change, the smallest echo, the subtlest shift in vibration. Paradoxically, in this constant awareness, a strange clarity emerged. By morning, when the bombardment finally ceased, the trenches were transformed. Mud was churned, sandbags flattened, and the familiar landscape had become alien, scarred, and dangerous. Thomas stepped over debris, checking for injuries, assessing the damage, and feeling an odd mix of relief and exhaustion. The world had survived another night, but at a cost, both seen and unseen. Even after the noise faded, its echo remained. Men flinched at distant cracks, hearts skipped at sudden pops, and the mind replayed the patterns of the previous night. Thomas understood then that the sound of shells was more than physical destruction. It was psychological, embedding itself into memory, shaping reactions, and haunting the frost-bound dreams of those who survived. And yet, life went on. Rations were delivered, the wounded were tended to, trenches were reinforced, and men continued their patrols. Amid the constant roar of artillery, amidst the mud, frost, and fear, Thomas realized that endurance was more than survival. It was the ability to keep moving, thinking, and imagining life beyond the thunder of shells. Mud was everywhere, not just wet or slippery, but alive, almost sentient in its persistence. It clung to boots, weighed down rifles, and seeped into every layer of clothing. Thomas had walked through mud before, but this winter, it seemed to have a mind of its own, a slow, creeping force that could swallow a man's foot in an instant. He learned quickly that every step required calculation, balance, and a stubborn will to move forward. Some sections of the trench were worse than others. The freezing rain from earlier days created a thin, hardened crust over deep, sucking mud. Step wrong, and the crust would crack, plunging him knee-deep into icy sludge. The mud pulled relentlessly, sucking boots, trapping fingers, and leaving men cursing as they struggled to free themselves. Thomas discovered that even the simplest movements, reaching for a shovel, climbing over a sandbag, became a battle of patience, strength, and endurance. The mud was not only a physical threat. It harbored sickness, carried disease, and made cleaning nearly impossible. Men tried to scrape it off, but once frozen, it embedded itself into seams, clothing, and hair. Frostbite often began in the toes and fingers, aggravated by the constant dampness and inability to keep warm. Thomas saw men with blackened, swollen toes, cursed for carelessness or simply misfortune, grimacing as they trudged through the muck, refusing to complain aloud. Sometimes, mud became a trap. A sudden collapse of frozen earth swallowed tools, boots, even entire crates of rations. The men would laugh bitterly, fight with their hands to reclaim lost supplies, and curse the trenches that had swallowed everything but their bodies. Thomas learned to keep a firm grip on every possession, to plan every step, and to respect the mud's power, no matter how small or shallow it seemed. Rats thrived here, too, their tiny claws and teeth as adept at navigating the mire as the men's boots. Sometimes Thomas would see them vanish into a puddle, only to emerge on the other side as if nothing had happened, mocking the struggle of human endurance. Even vermin were masters of the mud, and men could only hope to survive alongside them, not against them. Mud had its own rhythm. It slowed time, changed the pace of the day, and dictated every action. A simple patrol became an ordeal of planning and effort. A retreat or advance could take twice as long, exhausting men before they even faced the enemy. Even laughter and small moments of camaraderie were dampened by the effort of moving, the constant cold seeping through layers of frozen mud and water. Thomas began to respect the mud as much as the enemy. It was relentless, cunning, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. But in its own way, it taught him patience, adaptability, and the small victories of perseverance. Freeing a boot, dragging a trapped friend to safety, or crossing a particularly treacherous stretch without falling. Every successful step became a triumph, every struggle a reminder of resilience. By the end of the day, Thomas's boots were soaked, his trousers plastered to his legs, and his fingers raw from freezing water and mud scraping against skin. Yet he had survived, as had his companions. The mud had tested them, humiliated them, and exhausted them, but it had not defeated them. And in that bitter victory, Thomas realized that survival was not only about bullets or shells, but about enduring the small, persistent battles against frost, rats, and mud that threatened to swallow a man whole. Water was a constant struggle. Streams and rivulets that might have been simple sources of life in other times were now frozen, cruel, and treacherous. Thomas had learned to chip away at ice with his bayonet or shovel, hoping for a few precious drops to wash his face or moisten rations. Even a simple sip was a risk. Frostbitten fingers, shattered ice, or a sudden slide into a frozen trench could cost a man dearly. The frozen waterways were unpredictable. Some looked solid but gave way under a boot, plunging Thomas into icy water up to his knees. Other times, the ice held, but splinters cut his hands as he struggled to break a hole for water. Each attempt demanded careful balance, patience, and awareness of the sharp, unforgiving frost that seemed to wait eagerly for a misstep. Water was also a communal challenge. Lines formed at the few flowing sources, soldiers jostling for position while trying to avoid mud, frost, and slipping into the trenches. Rats often swam through the same puddles, unnoticed until one brushed against a boot or hand, sending shivers down the spine. Disease lurked in these icy pockets, a silent threat that could strike without warning. Thomas quickly learned to avoid drinking hastily, to filter debris with cloth, and to ration every drop for survival. The frost added another layer of danger. Even brief exposure to the icy streams could bring numbness to fingers and toes, threatening frostbite. Thomas had seen men lose digits in this very trench, victims of water and ice combined with exhaustion and mud. The combination of freezing temperatures and constant movement made every step deliberate, every decision critical. Despite the danger, the water had its moments of eerie beauty. Frost patterns etched themselves across the surface, intricate as lace, glinting faintly in the weak sunlight. Icicles hung from sandbags, catching light like tiny, frozen chandeliers. Thomas sometimes paused, mesmerized by these frozen displays, momentarily forgetting the mud, rats, and constant threat of artillery. It was a reminder that even in a world dominated by suffering, life could leave traces of artistry and wonder. The waterways were also a test of teamwork. Men helped each other across thin ice, guided each other past hidden puddles, and shared scraps of warmth in brief moments of rest. Ellis often led small groups, carrying extra water, steadying soldiers who had slipped, and reminding them of the fragile balance between survival and misfortune. Thomas began to understand that endurance in the trenches relied not just on personal skill, but on trust, coordination, and quiet acts of care. By nightfall, the frozen streams had become both allies and enemies. They provided water, but always at a cost: frostbite, exhaustion, or the risk of slipping into icy mud. Thomas returned to the trench, fingers stiff, boots soaked, and heart racing, grateful for the small victories and wary of the dangers still hidden under ice. He realized that every frozen puddle, every thin sheet of ice, was a reminder that life in the trench demanded constant vigilance, adaptability, and respect for the smallest details. And as he settled against the trench wall, listening to the faint groan of ice in the wind, Thomas understood something essential. Survival was not merely enduring bullets or shells, but navigating every hidden hazard: mud, rats, ice, and frost, in a landscape that sought to claim him, step by painstaking step. One morning, after a night spent shivering against the trench wall, Thomas noticed something unusual. A small, neatly folded piece of paper had landed near the parapet, carried perhaps by the wind or tossed intentionally from across no man's land. At first, he thought it was a trick, a trap, or some cruel joke. Yet, the envelope was intact, marked with neat handwriting in German, folded carefully as if the writer had paused to consider the weight of each word. Ellis peered over his shoulder. "Letters from the enemy?" he muttered, incredulous. Thomas unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the fragile paper. Inside, there were words that were unfamiliar yet hauntingly human. A soldier's note, not a threat, not an insult, but a simple acknowledgement. Survival was shared, no matter the uniform. The first note read something like this: "We see you there. We know you are cold, tired, afraid. We hope you survive the night. We will try to do the same." Thomas stared at it, the simple honesty catching him off guard. The war had reduced the landscape to mud, frost, and death. Yet here was a stranger hundreds of miles away, expressing the same fear, the same hope, the same desire to see another sunrise. More notes appeared over the next weeks. Sometimes they were crude sketches of soldiers' faces, some with captions like, "Keep moving, keep alive." Other times, they were small poems about the winter sky, the wind, the distant trees, and the strange beauty that survived even in hellish conditions. Thomas shared them with the men, who initially reacted with disbelief, suspicion, or laughter. But gradually, even Ellis admitted there was something unsettlingly real and comforting about these messages. The notes created strange, fragile connections. Even in the middle of chaos, across barbed wire and shellfire, there was a hint of shared humanity. It reminded Thomas that the enemy were men too, tired, hungry, and terrified. For a moment, the lines of the front became less absolute, and survival felt like a bond across frozen land, rather than merely a struggle against a uniform target. Sometimes, the notes included warnings: minefield ahead, be careful at dawn. Thomas would glance toward the landscape, imagining the sender in his own trench, facing the same dangers and trying, somehow, to communicate care despite the divide. It was eerie, almost dreamlike, a bridge of words spanning mud, frost, and fear. The letters also carried a dark humor. One had a crude drawing of a rat wearing a soldier's helmet, carrying a rifle twice its size, with a note in German that Thomas could barely decipher. But the intent was clear. Even rats were enlisted, even vermin had roles in this frozen nightmare. The men laughed, incredulous, and the shared amusement cut through the tension for a brief, precious moment. Thomas began to collect them carefully, tucking them under his coat, alongside letters from home. Both sets of correspondence, one from family, one from the enemy, offered reminders of life beyond the mud, frost, and wire. They were proof that humanity survived even here, in this place designed to strip it away. By nightfall, Thomas would read the notes quietly to himself, imagining the soldiers who wrote them, picturing them huddled in their trenches, thinking of survival, thinking of hope, just as he was. In a world dominated by fear, bullets, and frost, the notes were small, fragile reminders that even across battle lines, men were men first, vulnerable, weary, and profoundly human. And in that recognition, Thomas found a fleeting, almost forbidden comfort. A sense that even in war, kindness, humor, and connection could persist, whispered across snow, mud, and wire, carried by the fragile medium of paper. The nights had always been dangerous, but recently, a new threat emerged: a sniper. Thomas first heard whispers from Ellis and other soldiers. A shadow moving in the distance, a rifle glinting faintly in moonlight, men disappearing silently from the trenches. The enemy was patient, precise, and merciless, waiting for the smallest misstep, the faintest movement, to claim a life. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with frost. Every glance toward the horizon carried the possibility of being spotted, of a single bullet tearing through silence. The sniper was invisible and omnipresent, a ghost in the snowy landscape, turning every patrol and shift into a careful dance of survival. One night, Thomas had to cross a shallow stretch of no man's land to deliver ammunition. He moved slowly, crouched, and hugged the earth, counting every step, feeling the frost bite through gloves and boots. The wind carried distant artillery fire, but also whispers of tension from the trench, and Thomas's heart thumped as if it wanted to escape his chest. A faint glint caught his eye, a reflection from a scope, barely visible. He froze, every muscle tensed, and instinctively dropped to the snow, barely daring to breathe. Ellis had warned him, "If you see that glint, don't move. They are trained to anticipate panic. They want you to give them motion, sound, or fear." Thomas stayed motionless, counting seconds that felt like hours, letting the shadow pass, praying silently that the sniper had not aimed too precisely, that luck would favor him for once. The sniper's presence changed the trench. Men whispered, joked nervously, and double-checked cover before stepping out. Even small movements, fetching water, adjusting sandbags, repairing barbed wire, became calculated risks. The night felt alive with unseen eyes, every crack, every sparkle of frost a potential threat. Thomas learned to improvise. He moved when shadows masked him, crawled along frozen mud when the wind carried noise, and relied on subtle cues from the terrain and comrades. Every survival instinct sharpened. Fear became a tool teaching vigilance rather than paralyzing action. Yet the tension never left, a constant hum beneath the routine of trench life. The sniper was as much psychological as physical. Men started imagining shapes where none existed, hearing rustles in the wind and mistaking them for rifles. Even Ellis admitted to jumping at shadows, to double-checking the same patch of snow multiple times. Thomas realized that sometimes the enemy's greatest weapon was the fear they implanted, invisible and relentless. By dawn, when visibility returned, the landscape seemed less threatening, yet the weight of the night lingered. A fallen comrade was discovered, shot cleanly through the chest, a stark reminder that skill and patience could still win against even the most careful soldier. Thomas knelt, checking for signs of life, then retreated quietly, carrying a mixture of relief, sorrow, and a deeper understanding of how fragile existence had become in the winter trenches. The sniper had vanished, as silently as he had appeared, leaving behind only the echoes of fear. Thomas returned to the trench, drenched in sweat beneath layers of frost and mud, shaking from adrenaline and cold. The experience left a permanent mark, a reminder that survival in the trenches was not merely enduring the elements, rats, or artillery, but navigating the calculated, patient menace of a single, invisible foe. And as he huddled near the fire with Ellis and the other men, Thomas understood something essential. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to move through it, step by careful step, even when death seemed to be aiming at every motion. Supplies were lifelines, but in winter, they became traps of ice and frustration. Crates of rations, expected to sustain men for days, arrived frozen solid, nails stiff with cold, and would slick with frost. Thomas watched as soldiers struggled to pry open boxes with bayonets or bare hands, shivering, cursing, and occasionally laughing at the absurdity of it all. Even a simple loaf of bread could take 15 minutes to free from its icy prison. Meat, once a welcome sight, often arrived as solid blocks, impossible to cut or cook without considerable effort. Soup, when thawed, became thin, tasteless water, but it was better than nothing. Chocolate, meant to provide energy, was brittle and sharp, cracking under pressure, sometimes shattering into shards that cut fingers when handled too quickly. Every ration became a puzzle, a test of patience and ingenuity. Transporting supplies was equally perilous. Sleds dragged across frozen mud often tipped, spilling goods into deep trenches or icy puddles. Men slipped while carrying sacks, falling into frozen sludge, ruining both clothing and food. Even the strongest soldiers discovered that winter demanded more than muscle. It required caution, timing, and careful planning for each step. Thomas noticed the ingenuity that emerged from necessity. Soldiers used fire from small stoves to slowly thaw rations, huddling close to avoid frostbite. Some wrapped their boots in layers of cloth, using body heat to thaw frozen tools and keys. Others devised pulley systems to haul crates across treacherous stretches, minimizing loss and reducing the risk of injury. Yet, even the best-laid plans were vulnerable. A sudden freeze could refreeze partially thawed food, undoing hours of effort. Storms could bury supplies in snow, forcing men to dig frantically, desperate to recover what little remained. Thomas learned that resilience meant not just surviving the enemy, but battling the elements, improvising solutions, and accepting small victories amidst constant frustration. The frozen supplies affected morale as much as nutrition. Hunger gnawed more sharply when a loaf of bread required half an hour to reach edible state. Energy levels dropped, irritability rose, and minor arguments flared, only to be soothed by shared laughter when disaster struck in absurd ways. A sack of potatoes rolling into the trench like a small avalanche, a frozen bottle of water shattering upon impact. Even in misery, humor became survival, a quiet rebellion against frost and deprivation. Thomas learned to anticipate the limitations imposed by winter. He rationed small amounts, saved thawed food for those most in need, and shared warmth during long, laborious tasks. Each day became a strategy, timing movements, protecting supplies, and maintaining both physical and mental endurance. Even a minor success, such as delivering a crate intact or cutting a loaf without injury, felt like a triumph against the relentless season. By night, when men finally settled with cold rations and numb fingers, the frozen supplies remained both enemy and teacher. They reminded Thomas that survival in the trenches was as much about resourcefulness and patience as about courage or combat skill. Every thawed loaf, every preserved scrap of meat, was a small victory, a testament to human persistence, ingenuity, and the will to endure despite relentless frost, mud, and scarcity. And as Thomas lay in the trench, exhausted yet grateful, he realized that survival in winter wasn't simply avoiding bullets or shells. It was a constant, grinding negotiation with ice, mud, and scarcity, each day a battle in itself. Among the frost, mud, rats, and frozen supplies, letters from home became precious treasures. Thomas had learned to protect them, tucking them safely beneath layers of clothing, treating them as fragile talismans against the endless winter and the relentless front. Each envelope carried not just words, but warmth, a reminder of life beyond the trenches, and a fragile thread to a world untouched by bullets and frost. Reading the letters was a quiet ritual. Thomas would sit near a small fire, careful to shield the paper from stray sparks, and unfold the sheets slowly, savoring each word. His mother wrote about the village, the markets, and neighbors, filling pages with mundane details that somehow felt miraculous in contrast to the trenches. His father's letters contained advice and gentle warnings, urging patience, caution, and hope. Even friends included small sketches, jokes, and stories that made Thomas laugh despite freezing fingers and weary eyes. The letters carried smells, too, ink, paper, and faint traces of home, a sensory reminder that life outside the trenches continued. Thomas would close his eyes, imagining fields and trees, laughter and warmth, sunlight on his face instead of frost biting his cheeks. For a few moments, he was not in the mud, rats, and ice, but in a home that existed in memory and imagination, tangible and comforting. Yet, the letters also brought a bittersweet tension. News of illness, scarcity, or struggle at home reminded Thomas that survival was fragile everywhere, not just on the front. The contrast between the battlefield and the domestic world created a complex mix of gratitude and worry, a blend of hope and sorrow. He often reread passages, memorizing lines, savoring kindness, and drawing strength from the mundane human details that reminded him of why he endured. Sometimes, letters were shared. Ellis or other soldiers would glance over his shoulder, curious about jokes, news, or small updates from back home. These shared moments of connection built camaraderie, bridging the gap between individual longing and collective endurance. Even brief laughter, triggered by a humorous anecdote or a clever drawing, seemed magnified against the backdrop of freezing mud, artillery, and shadowy snipers. Thomas also began writing back when possible. His letters were simple, truthful, and careful to hide the harshest details. He described the cold, the mud, the rats, and occasional danger, but also survival, camaraderie, and small victories. He sent sketches of the trenches, snow, and frozen landscapes, knowing the words and images could carry hope, humor, and a sense of connection across hundreds of miles. The act of writing became therapeutic. It allowed him to process fear, fatigue, and the unrelenting cold. It reminded him that, despite war, frost, mud, and mortality, he was still a part of a larger world, one where love, care, and human connection persisted. Even the smallest lines from home could lift spirits, sharpen focus, and provide the resilience needed to face another day in frozen trenches. By the end of the day, Thomas folded the letters carefully, returning them to their protective place beneath clothing. He knew that tomorrow might bring frost, mud, artillery, and the sniper's shadow again, but he also carried proof of life beyond the front, a warmth that no winter, bullet, or rat could erase. Letters from home were not just words. They were lifelines, tiny beacons guiding him through endless nights and endless cold, reminding him that survival was not only about enduring the front, but also about preserving humanity amidst chaos. Silence was rare on the front, and when it came, it was heavy, almost unnatural. The winter wind would pause, carrying neither the distant roar of artillery nor the faint scuttle of rats. Thomas noticed it immediately, a sudden stillness that made the frost seem sharper, the mud darker, and the shadows longer. Men moved cautiously, voices hushed, every step measured as if disturbing the quiet might summon disaster. The silence brought its own fear. Without the constant background of noise, every sound became amplified. The creak of a sandbag, the snap of frozen wood, the drip of ice melting in the weak sunlight. Even the breathing of a comrade felt loud, intrusive, and ominous. Thomas realized that in the absence of motion and sound, imagination filled the void, conjuring enemies in every corner, every dip in the trench, every distant ridge. During one particular pause in fighting, Thomas crept along the trench, checking sandbags and parapets. The frost crunched softly beneath his boots, and he felt the weight of eyes he could not see, the certainty that the enemy might be watching, silent and patient. A sudden gust of wind sent a thin flake of snow drifting past, and Thomas flinched, convinced it masked a rifle sight, a waiting sniper, or a hidden grenade. Ellis whispered across the trench, breaking the spell of stillness. "Never trust the quiet," he said, voice low, almost reverent. Men nodded, moving like shadows, their movements deliberate, avoiding any noise that might betray their presence. The silence became a test of nerves, patience, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. At times, the quiet offered small, fleeting beauty. Snow-laden branches reflected pale moonlight, and distant hills seemed untouched by war. The stars shone more clearly, cold but brilliant, and Thomas felt for a moment that the world beyond the trenches still existed, untarnished and eternal. Yet the beauty was fragile. It was always tempered by the awareness that the next sound could bring chaos, the next step could summon death. The silence also magnified the smallest signals of life. A rat scurrying through frozen mud sounded like an army approaching. The faint drip of water from ice-laden sandbags seemed like artillery fire. Even the sigh of a comrade became a reminder of vulnerability, of the ever-present risk, and the delicate balance between survival and catastrophe. Men adapted in subtle ways. They communicated with whispers, gestures, and the occasional muffled laugh to preserve morale without breaking the quiet. Thomas found himself focusing on the rhythm of his own breath, the careful placement of each foot, and the constant mental mapping of the trench and surrounding terrain. The mind became as much a weapon as the rifle, training itself to anticipate danger, to read the faintest cues, to survive in a world dominated by stillness and frost. The winter trench's silence was a paradox, terrifying and mesmerizing, oppressive yet strangely beautiful. Thomas understood that it was another battlefield, an invisible opponent that tested patience, focus, and the human spirit. Every frozen gust, every shadow, every creaking board became part of a complex map of survival, reminding him that war was not only fought with bullets, shells, and shouts, but also with attention, caution, and an almost superhuman ability to endure the tension of quiet. By nightfall, the silence would finally break. A distant gunshot, a scuttling rat, the muffled call of a sentry, and the world would return to its grim rhythm. Yet Thomas carried the memory of those moments, a lesson that in the trenches, stillness could be as dangerous as any weapon, and that survival required constant vigilance, even in the absence of overt threat. Frostbite was a silent enemy, creeping without warning, striking fingers, toes, ears, and noses with equal cruelty. Thomas had seen it before, but experiencing it firsthand brought a chilling reality he could no longer ignore. The numbness started subtly, a tingling, a stiffness, then spreading like icy ink through flesh, until the affected part of the body felt alien, unresponsive, and fragile. Men tried every method to combat it. They huddled together, sharing body heat in brief clusters, rubbing frozen limbs against one another, and sipping lukewarm liquids whenever possible. Clothes were layered, but even multiple layers could not fully block the biting winter wind or the cold seeping from icy mud and frozen water. Thomas discovered that awareness, vigilance, and constant movement were as important as clothing. A brief pause could be enough for frostbite to take hold. The signs were subtle at first: pale skin, slight swelling, a prickling sensation, and the creeping realization that parts of the body no longer obeyed commands. Thomas learned to inspect hands and feet, listening for complaints and checking each man in his squad, knowing that ignoring even mild frostbite could result in permanent injury. Ellis, experienced and meticulous, drilled the importance of prevention. Keep moving, keep dry, and never underestimate the cold. Treatment was primitive but essential. Frozen fingers were slowly warmed against the body or in water barely above freezing, careful not to burn or crack the skin. Rubbing too hard could tear tissue. Warming too quickly could worsen the damage. Even small tasks, like changing boots or putting on gloves, became trials of dexterity and patience when numbness set in. Thomas felt a deep empathy for the men suffering, realizing that cold could be as deadly as a sniper's bullet or a falling shell. Frostbite also shaped behavior and strategy. Men learned to minimize exposure during patrols, to plan movements in short, calculated bursts, and to rotate duties to ensure everyone had a chance to thaw. The cold became a constant presence in decision-making, influencing when to move, when to dig, and when to rest. Even the simplest victory, such as maintaining warmth through the night, became a hard-earned achievement. Thomas observed how frostbite affected morale. Some men became irritable or despondent, frustrated by their inability to perform basic tasks. Others learned humor as a shield, joking about blue fingers or frozen toes, finding small relief in shared suffering. The camaraderie built in these moments, helping a comrade thaw hands, sharing warmth, and guiding one another across frozen mud, reinforced the bonds that made survival possible. He also realized the psychological impact. Fear of frostbite made men hyper-aware, alert to the cold's subtle threats, and cautious in ways that improved overall safety. Yet it also bred anxiety, a constant tension, knowing that one moment of carelessness could result in permanent injury. Thomas's nights were spent checking boots, gloves, and hats, reminding men to move, rub, and protect themselves, reinforcing vigilance and collective responsibility. By the end of a particularly harsh day, Thomas's own fingers ached, toes tingled, and the cold seemed to seep deeper than ever before. Yet the lessons endured: preparation, observation, empathy, and steady perseverance could stave off the cruelest effects of winter. Frostbite became more than a physical threat. It was a test of discipline, resilience, and the ability to care for oneself and others in a world dominated by ice, mud, and relentless hardship. And as Thomas lay in his trench, warming frozen hands against his chest, he understood a deeper truth. Survival in winter was not merely enduring bullets, shells, or snipers. It was mastering the cold, respecting its power, and ensuring that each man emerged intact, physically, mentally, and, if possible, with a sense of dignity still intact.